We begin tonight with the country losing its freaking mind. As you've probably noticed, the biggest issue in America right now, eclipsing almost everything, is whether a private group can build a religious community center and place of worship on private property. That is the debate that has colonized our national conversation. Everyone apparently must choose a side. It is the most pressing issue of national importance. Ever since the terrorist attacks in 9/11, 2001, we've occasionally had these massive, country-captivating debates about topics that seem so insane that even stepping into the fray of debating them threatens one's own sanity. And here we are again. The collective mass hysteria that has erupted over this particular issue is not the first time something like this has happened. Remember this?
It says, update, now serving in all house office building, Freedom Fries. And this is a real tribute. Whenever anyone orders Freedom Fries, I hope they will think about our men and women who are serving this great nation, who are willing to give their life for the freedoms that we all enjoy, so that now we can come in here freely and say, Freedom Fries, please.
You remember the brave legislators who decided to stick it to our allies in France back in 2003 because they wouldn't support the Iraq War? No longer did the House cafeteria serve French fries. No, they were renamed Freedom Fries. Amazingly, at the time, this seemed like a good idea to people. Restaurants jumped on board and started promoting their own Freedom Fries. And if it wasn't just fries either, it was also Freedom Toast. As the country was preparing for an unprovoked, ill-advised, and ill-fated war, that was what we were discussing. All thanks to a collective freakout against the French, who had the gall to oppose our planned invasion of Iraq. And let us also not forget the great duct tape freakout that happened the very same year.
Stash away the duct tape. Don't use it. Stash it away. And that pre-measured plastic sheeting for future, and I emphasize future use.
Duct tape and plastic sheeting to guard against a chemical attack. People started running out to stores and stocking up on all of the duct tape they could get their hands on. Duct tape landed on the cover of Time magazine. It got so bad that Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge had to essentially walk back his comments and calm everyone down.
What they should do now, if they've secured their supply kit, is they ought to go pick the kids up at school because it's Friday, and they ought to go to the soccer games, and they ought to go to work because they've done all we want them to do now.
For the love of God, people, enough with the duct tape. Later turned out, of course, that none of this would have actually saved you from a chemical attack. It also turned out there was no genuine intelligence suggesting that such an attack was imminent. But the Bush administration said we should all be crazy about something, and somehow we decided collectively, people, the media, politicians, that they were right. We were all just going to be really crazy for a little while, together. Crazy together. Last summer, the whole country decided to lose its mind again over health reform. We were having a serious national discussion over whether the government was going to pass a law that would mandate the execution of senior citizens. Politicians were going around the country and warning about the government, quote, pulling the plug on grandma. I mean, when the death penalty idea first came out, everybody thought it was laughably bonkers. And then somehow we were all debating whether or not it was true. All these freakouts were started by right-wingers, but they eventually managed to infect the entire media bloodstream. And after every one of these moments, when the country decides to go crazy together, we all just sort of wake up afterwards and look back and think, really? There's a kind of shame-inducing hangover that comes from these things. I mean, Freedom Fries? History has not looked very kindly upon that whole episode. Even the guy who came up with Freedom Fries in the first place, Republican Congressman Walter Jones, later regretted having done so, saying, quote, I wish it had never happened. This whole national freakout thing is not new either. This is not just a post-9/11 thing. We've actually done this quite a bit in American history. We had the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s. We had Japanese internment after Pearl Harbor. We had McCarthyism during the height of the Red Scare back in the 1940s and 50s. Those were all far more destructive than this current unpleasantness. And what unites all of these episodes is that in retrospect, we look back and think, you know what? That was a really bad idea. That was actually really embarrassing. It's like waking up from a really bad bender when you've done some really shameful things and finding out the pictures of those things are all over Facebook. Right now, the country is going through such a bender with respect to this community center in downtown Manhattan. This story elevated again to a national issue on Friday night when President Obama appeared to endorse the project at the White House. You know we're in one of these moments of national madness when the president is able to make news by affirming his support for the First Amendment. Mr. Obama then appeared to walk that back the next day, which only served to further fan the flames of this invented controversy. We're going to talk a little bit about the actual arguments here, such as they exist. But before we even get into the substance, I want everyone watching this program just to take a deep breath and really think about what this is going to look like 4 years from now, or 5 years from now, or 20 years from now. Which side of this debate will come out looking good when history renders its judgment? You don't want to be on the side of freedom fries. Joining us now is Princeton University professor, columnist for The Nation magazine, and MSNBC contributor, Melissa Harris-Laisel. Melissa, thank you for joining us tonight.
Hi, Chris. Good to see you.
Good to see you, too. So we've had these kind of moments before, and I guess I wonder what you think is the origins of this, both broadly as a kind of trend in American history and right now. Why is this is it just that it's August and there's no shark attacks?
Well, I guess there's probably a couple of things going on. Every example that you used in your introduction is an example about vulnerability and our sense of collective vulnerability. Perhaps nothing more clearly illustrates that than 9/11, that sense of being caught off guard, that sense that something that we imagined could not happen in the United States, in fact, did happen here. And so the fact that the American public feels a sense of anxiety in the face of such vulnerability, I think, is not surprising. I mean, you could make a metaphor to your own life. Think about times when something has caused a sense of vulnerability in your own life, whether it's, having your house broken into or even, having a car accident at an intersection that you then avoid. One of the things that we do as humans then is to try to, build around ourselves a set of walls that will keep us from ever feeling that sense of danger and vulnerability again. But it's precisely because it's that kind of human reaction to behave in that, really troubling way of building walls, that's why we need to have a constitution,
right,
why we need to have leaders,
right,
why we need to have a system that doesn't allow us to do that.
Right, and I think that's a really important point. I don't want to, and it's like you don't want to get too snarky about this or too dismissive, because I've looked at the polling, and I know there are probably people watching this program, right, who are feeling conflicted about this. I do think, though, in terms of the vulnerability argument, what's surprising to me are two things. One, that it seems to have gotten worse over time, that this is happening now in 2010 and not in 2002. And two, that it's being driven by leaders who are so sort of opportunistically and demagogically driving this. And that's what's really disturbing to me.
Yeah, I think that what we really need to be putting our finger on here is the question of leadership. Look, Americans have what we call a principal policy gap. You go out and do a survey, 90% of Americans will tell you, I agree and support, for example, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. But ask them if a communist atheist should be able to hold a rally on their neighborhood street corner, and they'll say no. So there's a gap between, right, on the one hand, the principle, and on the other hand, the policy. So this is, again, why we need to recognize that as Americans, the thing that makes America unique and interesting and such a great project in world history is that we meet vulnerability not with this kind of terrorized anxiety, but instead by actually opening ourselves up by saying, our government, our nation, is strong enough to manage dissent. We are big enough and bold enough to allow our citizens to freely assemble, to worship as they see fit, and heck, to even, zone locally. I mean,
right, right.
These are the kind of American precepts that we need to be holding on to in this moment.
9/11 has worked so well as a political wedge for Republicans over the past decade, and they've kind of gone to it again and again. I wonder if this is kind of there's no more juice left in the orange. They're trying to sort of squeeze the last drops out of it, or is this a turn towards something darker? It seems to me like we've crossed some sort of barrier with this, and this is sort of qualitatively different than some of the war on terror kind of culture war baiting that we saw, over the last 9 years.
Look, this is really ugly, and I got to say, I think it's really ugly in part because of the timing. Yeah. I know that it's a midterm election, and so, yes, I think part of this is some GOP leaders trying to pull the last little bit of political capital they can out of 9/11. But it is Ramadan. It is a holy time for Muslims. And on top of that, in the Muslim world right now, there is an enormous tragedy. 15 million people in Pakistan are suffering.
Yeah.
And one thing that we could do as Americans is to say, okay, rather than being exclusionary, rather than fighting over a piece of ground as sacred and hollow as it may be in our national understanding, that instead we will reach out to the millions of Muslims who are currently suffering through no fault of their own as a result of this horrifying natural disaster during a high holy moment. What might that say about who we are as Americans instead of having this fight over this little parcel of land?
Princeton University professor, columnist, and colleague of mine at The Nation, and MSNBC contributor Melissa Harris-Lacewell, thank you so much for your time tonight. It's such a pleasure.
Always, Chris. Thanks.